Good evening, everyone. Just to let you know, we're just going to wait 1 or 2 minutes because we're just waiting on two of our participants. Hopefully, they'll be with us imminently. So, yeah, if you just hold on for a moment, please, we'll start the event very soon. Thank you. Okay, I think while we're waiting for our two participants to arrive still, we can make a start, change the order up a little bit. Um, so Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And good evening or good morning if you're in Australia time right now, as Tristan will be when he joins us. Um, Thank you so much for taking your evening out to join us at Cage. For those of you who aren't aware, Cage is an advocacy organization that largely works to help those who have been impacted by the policies of the global war on terror. So since 11 September 2001, we've operated and kind of worked on cases ranging from Guantanamo Bay to Abu Ghraib to secret prisons around the world. But of course, look at domestic legislation and the way that it impacts largely Muslim populations through counterterrorism legislation. Thank you for joining us on YouTube. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel where we regularly update with events and various other videos and campaigning work, which hopefully many of you can get yourselves involved in. So today's event really was to try and not, I guess, commemorate, but use the second anniversary of Priti Patel's, who was the UK Home Secretary at that time, designation of Hamas's political wing as a terrorist organization. Now, this is important because up until this moment, only the military wing had been proscribed, meant that it carried the label of being a formal terrorist organization, which carries with it lots of implications in terms of financing arrangements, in terms of travel, and so on and so forth, especially within the countries that kind of make a Eurocentric and American bloc. So that, of course, has implications. It has implications for the Palestinian resistance movements that are both in the West Bank and Gaza. It has implications for people abroad who might generally support the Palestinian right to resistance, because these legal regimes have impacts that go far beyond simply, a designation. It has lots of implications. And what we thought was to bring together three different experts who have all written in and around this area, either directly about Hamas as an organization or about the whole program of proscription, the politics of it, the reasons why it's used, whether or not it's effective, And in that regard, I have three brilliant panelists, one of whom is with us right now, but hopefully we'll have the other two with us very soon. But just to tell you a little bit about them as a very quick introduction. The first is Dr. Azzam Tamimi, who will hopefully be joining us very soon. He is the author of Hamas Unwritten Chapters. It's an excellent book on the history of the organization, a lot of the politics that and the context that surrounded the formation of Hamas, some of the kind of insights that many of us don't know about the reasons why the organization was formed and the type of internal debates they had about who they wanted to be as a group, but also how external factors were constantly shaping how the group developed in its own thinking and its practice. We also will have, when he arrives hopefully soon, Tristan Dunning, who wrote this book, Hamas, Jihad and Popular Legitimacy, which is another excellent book, looking at reinterpreting the ways in which resistance is understood in Palestine. And he does cover, to some degree, the politics of the organization being proscribed. Last, but definitely not least, is Dr. Sophie Haspeslagh, whose book, Proscribing Peace, specifically focuses on looking at the legal regime and political regime of proscription laws around the world, especially after the post 9/11 moment. Now, the book mostly focuses on FARC in Colombia, but what Sophie does so well is to take lessons in many other contexts outside of that by looking at the ways that these legal regimes operate. So we're still waiting for our guests. I'm going to just ask for one moment because one of our guests is struggling to enter the room that we've created. So I'm going to ask somebody to help with that. Just bear with me one moment. Sophie, my apologies. Let's you and I begin. Again, you've written a brilliant book that focuses on the legal regimes and the politics of proscription. There are many different organizations out there that are involved in various types of resistance movements. They're involved in different types of militancy. And they are all largely covered by, say, for example, the proscription regime in the UK, or an EU one, the US version. There's a UN version as well of this. These are all different lists, but I think they largely have the same effect, albeit with some differences. So I wanted to ask you, that while groups, they were labeled as terrorist organizations prior to 9/11 and before the attacks from the US. What can you tell us about that moment and the way in which it changes the landscape of what it means to be labeled a terrorist organization, especially after the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1373? Thank you.
So, I mean, the short answer is that obviously the events of 9/11 and the attack on the World Trade Center shifted these questions absolutely radically. And so while labels have always been used in politics, but also in conflict and armed conflict, they're generally used to delegitimize your opponent, vice versa. Kind of dual vilification processes have always been incredibly common. Whether, during colonial times, during self-determination movements, in armed conflicts, incredibly widespread. What we see is that not only did you have the label being used, for instance, the terrorist label, but you also had national proscription regimes. So, for instance, the UK was one of the first to have a proscription regime since 1974, and that was very much developed in the context of the Northern Irish conflict at the time. But it also developed an international list where it had ANC, the PLO, other groups. But at the time, it was very much seen as a British list, for instance, right? And then later, it was later actually in the 1990s that the US developed their own proscription regimes. What changed really radically after 9/11 is that these listing regimes ceased being just national lists, but they became embedded in the international and multilateral system. So when the world rallied around the US after 9/11, and the UN Security Council passed a number of resolutions around that. One of the resolutions that you mentioned is 1373. Now, what was particularly important with this resolution is that it's the first time that the UN used Chapter 7, which is the right to self-defense of a state, against a non-state actor. So that's incredibly new. And it's only been, 20 years plus, basically, that was used for the first time in the UN. So the idea being that the UN, having not defined what terrorism was, because they couldn't agree on it, decided to develop a listing regime within the UN that under 1373 encouraged states to develop their own listing regimes, right? So the other lists you mentioned, for instance, the EU list, or even some other countries' lists, like Egypt, wherever, all these lists, they come out of the UN listing regime. So it was very much the UN that sort of made it compulsory, if you want, for all member states around the world to develop listing regimes. So what does that mean in practice? That means that the definition of what terrorism was, didn't exist. So it was decentralized, if you want, at the member state level for every country to kind of define who their terrorists were and to kind of create their own proscription regime. At an international level, something quite fundamental changed in that, whereas before certain, self-determination groups, particular armed movements, that sort of thing might be seen, by certain countries or others as, kind of liberation movements. Others might have the perspective that they were terrorists. You had a kind of multiplicities of views, if you want, sometimes on violence and the legitimacy of that violence. Well, after 1373 and these big changes within the UN, what shifted radically is that when a group is on a list of being, considered a terrorist organization, then that multilateral system completely underpins that, right? So it kind of sides with that perspective on that particular group. And that comes with heightened legitimacy, if you want, for whichever state is battling that group. And so reinforced even more the kind of the way the international system is obviously much more geared towards, being supportive or legitimizing state violence, let's say, as opposed to kind of non-state violence. And so that came with quite a lot of both material and more symbolic implications, right? So you mentioned the asset freeze and the travel ban. So those are sort of part and parcel of most proscription regimes, of most listing regimes. But then so that means that assets are frozen, that people members of the group can't travel. Obviously, the politics is rendered criminal. Any kind of support for an organization that's listed as well is criminalized. But I think one really important element that we often omit, when we're talking about these things, it's the huge delegitimization, right, of these actors, and not just the listed actor, but also all the communities associated potentially, right, around that actor. And as you mentioned in my book, I look at the case of Colombia in particular, and I did a kind of quite a historical perspective, if you want, on it, where I looked at a time where before 9/11 and the implications that engaging with, say, the FARC had for, say, the Colombian government and the international system, and then looked at how it worked, after 9/11, and when the listing of the FARC as terrorists took on a very different meaning. And so I could see the kind of really fundamental shifts it had on those processes.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Because, ultimately, these lists and the way that they're created, they do serve a purpose, right? Which is to effectively say that X group, Y group, they are beyond the pale, and therefore we're not going to engage with them at all, as far as they're concerned, that they're outside of the morality of what the state considers to be a legitimate response to the violence of the state, often. And in the historic record, we do have this notion that Western states, they claim that they don't negotiate with terrorists who take up like armed struggle. And that process of vilification it's important. They have to label them that way. They have to label them as terrorists in order to kind of keep this idea that we're the moral actors in any given situation. But eventually they do end up talking, don't they? So and this is the question, like, why bother attaching the label of terrorism in the first place if eventually you're going to have to talk at some point in the future? And I think your book does such a great service in helping to show that they do all come around to the table in the end.
So yes, they do negotiate with terrorists, and we can even see, in the context of Hamas today, even Israel and Hamas negotiating on hostages, right? So whatever type of negotiation, and there's a huge range, right? So that doesn't mean, that kind of hostage negotiation is a very different affair than negotiating in the scope of a political process, an actual sort of peace agreement or that sort of thing. But historically, yes, governments do tend to negotiate. And so I guess that for me was the big motivation when I wrote the book was, well, it happens, but what is the effect of one on the other, right? How does the kind of the listing of the non-state armed actor as a terrorist affect this process of negotiation, especially in the early phase, right? Even getting things going, and how it can have quite a big impact. And so I guess particularly with this listing regimes and since 9/11, it's important, I think, as well to bear in mind that these lists homogenize and amalgamate a whole range of different armed groups together, right? So one of the kind of big effects of listing is to really decontextualize, if you want, these groups. So they're kind of no longer understood or seen in their particular dynamics, conflicts, context, socio-political, whether, there's a kind of, what sort of political space there is or not, what's the history of the conflict. So these actors, once on these lists, are really kind of seen and understood as terrorists and only as terrorists, right? So you're no longer, there's a kind of a sort of a decontextualization that means that you don't see all the other elements of the group and all the complexity, within a group. That a group can also be a social movement, it can be a political party, it can have an armed going, it can have different strategies, it can shift. It's also the history of how the group came about, and that's why I really hope the panelists that are joining us tonight are coming soon, because they're going to be able to give that much more in this context, because this is not one that I'm working on as directly at all. But I think the thing with listing and the terrorist listing in particular is that, as I mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation, you know, labeling and basically vilification happens in all armed conflicts and in all kind of, you know, contexts. But with the sort of terrorist tag, it's really an extreme form of vilification. And so in the particular context I looked at in Colombia, what I found was that it's not just that the FARC were the opponent, right? That they were sort of vilified as, you know, being kind of violent or, you know, other or that sort of thing. But it became to an extent where they were, you know, really seen as inhuman and barbarous, right? They were seen as completely irrational and, you know, not being able to make sense with them, as completely apolitical and criminal, right? And another key element for me was that, for instance, in the case of the FARC, is that they completely disappeared from discourse as well. So they became kind of mixed to kind of very amorphous terrorist threat. So the thing is that with listing, in a way, it's a very effective way for governments to completely delegitimize and also to criminalize not just the group, but often the whole political ideas and projects that are around the group. And there's a lot, you know, of literature out there already on, like, for instance, other contexts where that has happened, you know, within the Kurdish movements and lots of other movements. The Basque context is a very interesting one as well, because that's in Europe, where you had, you know, ETA, the armed movement of the Basque nationalist movement that was listed. But in that particular case, the political wing was listed as well, Batasuna, but also youth organizations, cultural movements, etc., right? So just to going back a bit more to your question, the thing is that when you know, a political solution is being explored, right, and at the end of the day, you know, there are no really military kind of answers to any of these questions. And so when a political solution does come about and governments do want to shift their strategy, they've created this terrorist opponent to such a degree that they're in a policy straitjacket, right? It's really hard to shift. On the one hand, to convince your own citizens, your own public, that you've been, you know, telling them these people are terrorists, they're inhuman, they're barbarous, etc. How do you suddenly turn around and be like, we want to negotiate, we think, you know? So that's kind of a really fundamental shift, right? So that's one element. And another element is that the group itself, right? And that's often what we don't think about, is also the perspective from the listed entity. And I think that's one of the things where also my research is going, is how groups are also going to react differently to that label and to the listing, right? And you can't kind of, there's not necessarily a homogenous type of response. But one thing that's for sure is that if the political option is no longer or not on the table, what can the group really perceive, right, as a political way out? So how can the government you know, make the case, if you want, of that happening? I can see someone joining us.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Yeah, I want to come back to you about this this element of vilification, because I think, you know, your book presents such an amazing model for the way out, a process of devilification that you write about a lot in the book, but even a specific term that you use called a linguistic ceasefire, and why that's so important. But I'm gonna save that to the hopefully like more solutions-based conversation near the end. And I'm very, very pleased for us to be joined by Dr. Azzam Tamimi. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Dr. Azzam. You're on mute, Sheikh. My apologies.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much for joining us. I very much appreciate your time. And my apologies for the technical difficulties of getting you into the room. Alhamdulillah, it's good to have you here with us now. Dr. Azzam, I already gave an introduction and a short, very brief background to you before we started. So if you don't mind, we'll get straight into the questions. And, you know, Sophie has been talking to us about the whole legal regime of prescription laws, how they became entrenched post 9/11. But I want us to actually take this all the way back to Hamas itself as an organization and the context within which it was founded, because we're going to try and move this conversation specifically to think a little bit about Hamas in the context of it being banned as an organization, both its political and its military wings. So, it's interesting because the targeting of Al-Shifa hospital that we've seen by Israel, it brings us back full circle to Hamas in many ways, because this is 36 years after Hamas's formation. And it was at the Al-Shifa hospital that a general strike was called by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and other leaders, like directly outside the hospital. And that leads to the formation of Harakat al-Maqawwama al-Islamiyya, so more colloquially known as Hamas in its kind of current iteration. The strike was called by the leaders in response to an Israeli plowing his military tractor into Gazans, returning from their work in Israel, killing 3 and injuring many others. What the international media at the time referred to as a traffic incident, as opposed to what it was, which was an intentional killing of these Gazan workers. It's that moment that precipitates the first Intifada and the formation of Hamas. But the general strike that was called by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, was explicitly non-violent in its response. So can you tell us a little bit about that particular the starting of that as a non-violent Intifada, and how it turned into something that was more violent and set Hamas on the course to its current trajectory? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. You see, Hamas, before it was formed on that day you referred to, was actually the organization of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, a socio-cultural sort of organization that was primarily concerned with education, with what we call in Arabic tarbiyah, with reform, societal reform, because the Muslim Brotherhood believe that you can achieve overall reform if you start with the individual, and then from the individual you reform the family, and then from the family you move on to society, etc. And for a number of years, the Muslim Brotherhood was not involved or was not engaged in any resistance activism, whereas the factions of the PLO and Islamic Jihad, which was formed by a splinter group that departed the Muslim Brotherhood in the early 80s, were actually doing that. Pressure was forming on the leadership of the movement to do something about this. There was an attempt early on in 1983, but it was an attempt by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and a few individuals without the consent of the leadership. And that attempt failed, and they were arrested, and Sheikh Ahmed Yassin sent to prison. Later on, he came out in a prisoner's exchange. But what happened actually is that when the Intifada erupted in December 1987, that pressure culminated in a decision on the part of the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza to transform themselves into a resistance movement. Now, initially, it wasn't clear what that resistance was going to be about. So they engaged in calling for strikes, for strike actions, for calling for joining demonstrations, for throwing stones, because that uprising was known as the uprising of the stones. Yet, as a result of the severe crackdown by the Israeli occupation authorities on participants in these overly or on the overall peaceful acts of resistance, some members of the movement started using knives to protect themselves and to attack Israeli soldiers, Israeli occupation soldiers. And that then developed into snatching rifles or guns from those soldiers and using them either to fight back or to kidnap soldiers and bargain on them. There were several attempts, but usually they resulted in Israel killing hostages and hostage takers. And I guess this was the birth, the moment that Azzuddin al-Qassam, the military part of the movement, the military wing of the movement, came into existence by those members who were using whatever means and tactics that were available to them in order to really engage Israeli occupation forces with force. I think the major development happened in 1994, when in February of that year, which was the month of Ramadan, a Jewish settler by the name of Baruch Goldstein from Kriyat Arba'a, which is next to my hometown, Al Khalil, in the West Bank, stormed into Haram al-Ibrahimi, the Ibrahimi mosque, and sprayed worshippers during the Fajr prayer, dawn prayers, killing scores of them. Here, the movement felt the need to develop a new tactic, and they started resorting to what they called the martyrdom operations and what became known in the West as the suicide operations. And those operations were really very devastating for the Israelis, and the Israelis even went and saw Sheikh Ahmad Yassin in his prison, because he had been in prison since 1988 or 89. And they asked him how this could come to an end. And he proposed that, okay, let's have a hudna. And this was actually the birth of the concept of hudna in the discourse of the movement. And then from then on, we saw further developments when they gave up the martyrdom operations, when they developed the rockets, and then after the rockets, they developed other things. And now it seems that Al-Qassam have been able to make use of the latest technology available to any military formation in the world.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that history and that context is so important, so crucial for us to understand, kind of the push factors that really create the environment for that type of violence to emerge. And it's interesting what you say about like these kind of like different moments where, as the technology changes, as their access to weaponry changes, they change as well. So, starting off non-violent, moving to knives, then using their own bodies, and finally developing these rockets that are able to carry out further attacks at much further distance, not necessarily having to put their own bodies directly on the line. I'd like you to perhaps help us understand a little bit more about that context, because, quite often within a public discourse, the Palestinian resistance is reduced simply to Hamas, right? Like as if it's the only group that's actually fighting in either the West Bank or Gaza. But that's quite far from the truth, right? Like I think from what I understand, there are a number of different groups that are operating at the same time that, have been disenfranchised from kind of the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO in particular. That they have been disenfranchised from the idea and the notion that there will be a savior that will emerge from the Arab world, from the wider Arab world. So could you tell us a little bit more about these other groups, how they interact with Hamas, and how, and if at all, they form a block of resistance for the Palestinians?
Well, increasingly, with the passage of time, that bloc seems to have materialized, maybe consisting primarily of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. You know, Islamic Jihad share with Hamas the same distant background, because the founder of Islamic Jihad was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. He was even a pupil of Sheikh Ahmad Yassin. We're talking here about Fathi Shiqaqi, who was assassinated in Malta by the Israelis. There are a number of PLO factions like the PFLP who also have military wings and seem to join in, though of course because they are funded by the PLO, they tend at times to toe the line of the PLO. And when the PLO, and the reason actually for the prominence of Hamas and Islamic Jihad is that the PLO decided to go down the route of peacemaking with Israel according to the Oslo formula, which initially seemed promising, at least in the eyes of some Palestinians, but 5 years down the line, it was exposed as a farce, as nothing but the transformation of the National Liberation Movement into a security agency working for the occupation itself. So increasingly, the Palestinian masses put their trust more on those who are outside the PLO than those who were inside the PLO. Of course, prior to Oslo, I mean, years before Oslo, Fatah was the main liberation movement. The PFLP carried out a lot of operations, some of which at the global level. But this all became really history when the PLO decided to make peace with Israel according to Israeli conditions. There was a time when even Islamic Jihad contemplated or played with the idea of dissolving themselves and just joining Hamas, because they thought, okay, why do we have two separate platforms for resistance if we agree almost on everything? But I think regional politics, as well as international politics, keep the situation as it is, but there is a high degree of coordination between the two sides.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really useful. Just to kind of understand a little bit more, because as I said, that so much of the conversation that we're having today is around framing, right? So even within the media, you have this idea of Israel-Hamas war that's taking place, which is interesting because when you watch the interviews of Hussam Zumlut, of Hanan Ashrawi, of many other commentators who are more closely associated with the PA or the PLO and Fatah and other organizations, especially those that are based in the West Bank, what you don't find amongst their voices is the voice of condemnation over this breakout of this concentration camp by the Palestinian resistance movements in Gaza. It's been really interesting, and I've been watching so many of the interviews, and almost to a person, you don't hear that voice of condemnation. What you do hear a great deal of is context. They're consistently providing context. Whenever they're asked any question, their instinct is to say, okay, hold on a second, you're asking me about this thing, let me take you back 75 years, let me take you back 100 years. Let's actually place this thing in its correct context. And so, within that public domain, the language that we use is so essential and critical to the way in which these organizations are not only legally structured, but also structured in the minds of the general public as well. And Sophie, coming back to you, your book presents a model for ending conflict that's worth for us thinking through as we look towards a long-term and maintainable kind of peace for this region. This model informs us that there needs to be a process of de-vilification of any group that's labeled as a terrorist group, that the force with power must create the appearance of symmetry, that it is in some kind of relationship with the force that's opposing it, and finally accept that that eventually they always will come to some kind of stalemate because the conflict is mutually hurtful, in order to find a way out. So part of this process, this model that you present, is something called a linguistic ceasefire, which for me is one of the most kind of interesting aspects of the whole book. I really enjoyed the sections where you kind of go into detail about what this linguistic ceasefire is, because, you know, I mean, it does what it says in the 10, really, which is it's in the language itself. Like so much of the process of vilification, because it's in the language, the ceasefire first has to begin at the point of language. So could you tell us a little bit more about what this linguistic ceasefire is, how it can be realized, and how we might apply it to organizations like Islamic Jihad or Hamas, who are clearly in are trying to break out of this concentration camp that they're living in? Sorry, Sophie, you're
I was muted. So going back to what we were discussing earlier about, what happens when a government actually wants to change its policy and, engage in negotiation with a listed group. We know that sort of delisting ahead of kind of a formal negotiation is going to be near impossible. And actually, my book traced the case of Colombia, which I thought was particularly interesting because it's one of the only cases, the FARC, that has been delisted. So they've been delisted by the European Union and by the United States since the peace agreement with the government. And so, but before that all happened, before the negotiations took place, what I kind of traced in the data that I gathered, basically over 20 years between the Colombian government and the FARC, was this idea of vilification, devilification, but how the language shifted. And so what I saw was that in a context where you didn't have the kind of terrorism listing, that shifted much more fluidly, right? And as you mentioned, it's very much a relational element. It has to happen on both sides. In the terrorist context, sort of terrorist framing of one side as a terrorist, you didn't see that fluidity, right? That couldn't happen. And so what I really saw was that there was a real sort of shift in the discourse and the language, but that went way beyond that. So this idea of a linguistic ceasefire. So sort of what I conceptualize is that a linguistic ceasefire needed three components. The first one, which was really key, was about recontextualizing the group in the reality. So it was about how, with the terrorist framing, we're kind of, putting an organization in a kind of amorphous terrorist threat, and everything we discussed before, the kind of, there's no history, there's no context, etc. So the first point of the linguistic ceasefire was really, in the case of Colombia, it was actually the head of the government, Juan Manuel Santos at the time, who acknowledged the reality, like the existence of a conflict, right? And so that was kind of a really key element. The second one was around dropping the actual terrorist label, so no longer using it, referring to other labels, right? There's a plethora of ways to describe violence or, armed actors or militants or, resistance or whatever it is, but kind of using all sorts of much broader language and categorization. And then the third one was really about, actions continued being condemned, right? Violent actions, and condemning those on both sides, really, in the sense of acknowledging the violence, the hurt, the pain, etc., but no longer linking the act and the actor, right? So not this idea that, and I know we disagree on the point of whether there can be such a thing as terrorist violence. It'd be interesting to discuss it, but not linking that type of violence with the particular actor, right? So kind of separating the two, and the idea that change could happen, because if you're linking the two, the idea is that, you can never be anything but a terrorist. And if you're able to kind of separate that, then you can kind of engage with shifts in behavior, shifts in strategy, and potentially a kind of a transition away from that in the context of a political solution. So I think the bigger story, though, behind the linguistic ceasefires as well, that you need to have a political process for that to happen, right? And generally speaking, you need a peace process, though in some contexts it doesn't happen like that. Like the Basque Country that I mentioned earlier, there it was a really fascinating unilateral transition of the group itself, because the government refused to engage with it in terms of negotiation, right? And the linguistic ceasefire couldn't take place. And so what I think is interesting with the concept is that there are a lot of things that can be taken from it and done that can also be done by groups themselves. There's also this notion of self-devilification, which I think is also really important. So what can also be done to move away from how one is perceived or not? And in the context of Colombia, for instance, with the FARC, a really essential component to that was the release of hostages, and also a kind of an agreement that hostage taking was no longer something that the organization was going to do. They didn't talk about hostages; they were talking about retention, in their particular case. And in their process, before a process happened, actually 40 different hostages were released, and there was a kind of a renunciation of using those kind of tactics and strategies, if you like. So the idea of the linguistic ceasefire, what I find interesting with that is that, and I guess in general with the book, is kind of to try and separate, if you like, the violence, right, with the actors, and also when it comes to kind of international policy on these questions, it's also this idea that you're much more able to, whether it is to engage with and potentially disassociate with actions, whether they come from the state or a non-state actor, right? So that certain violent actions are going to be committed by either sides, and we know that. The thing with the terrorist label is that it associated a type of violence just with the non-state actor, and so it's kind of about separating that very much.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Yeah, I really want us to try and figure out, hopefully by the end of this conversation, the contours of everything that you've been describing so far in your interventions in relation to Hamas, because it's quite an interesting moment that the vast majority of the world does not consider this resistance movement as a terrorist organization. So largely, the countries that do have a very, very political purpose by which they classify it in that way. And so we have to think about that a little bit. What does it tell us when there isn't any uniformity in the politics of the world around a specific group? And so then what purpose is that group being listed in such a way, with all of these legal consequences that arise out of it? And maybe that's a brilliant time to bring in Dr. Tristan Dunning, who is I introduced at the start, Tristan, so I won't go through the whole introduction again, but I did mention that you've written an excellent book on Hamas, jihad, and popular legitimacy. And I guess, staying with this theme, you have studied the material that Hamas has produced over the years, but also the nature of the Israeli occupation itself. In your book, you write, in the Palestinian case, resistance is primarily a reaction to Israeli power exercised in the form of occupation, domination, and repression. According to Hamas, moreover, armed jihad is conceived as a purely defensive measure. So you write in your book a lot, you frame it initially in the context of Orientalism. So what can you tell us about the way in which Hamas is framed by the West, as opposed to the way it describes itself? And Sophie just spoke about this thing called a linguistic ceasefire. I know you've read Sophie's work yourself, and so maybe you can try and tie some of these elements together, please. And thank you again for joining us. I know it's so early in the morning for you.
No, I apologize. First of all, just time zones overslept. But when we talk about kind of the Orientalist perspective and terrorism designation, it's kind of the same thing. Basically, you're cutting off any route to dialogue. The terrorist designation that's happened here in Australia, that's happened in the UK, we can see that it's used as a carte blanche excuse for Israeli disproportionate reaction. And it means that there's no external leverage, because we don't talk to terrorists, of course, which is ridiculous when it comes down to it. And the West has forfeited any, I guess, moral high standing over the last 5 weeks. That this whole never again thing is, you have senior Israeli ministers talking about ethnic cleansing, about kind of almost a final solution when it comes down to it. And what we're seeing in Gaza is just, I think, a precursor to what's going on undercover, basically, in the West Bank and in Area C, in terms of ethnic cleansing. So it really is, as B'Tselem has said, as Human Rights has said, Human Rights Watch, as Amnesty has said, there's kind of this Jewish supremacy in the occupied territories. And it seems quite clear that the goal is to make sure that Palestinian national aspirations are extinguished, and to push the Palestinians out of Area C and to ghettoize them. I mean, it's as simple as that. And with Sophie's work, proscribing organizations means that there is no leverage from outside, and it leaves no avenue for dialogue and for negotiation, which Hamas has previously shown that it is willing to do. If we look back at its 2017 new charter accepting a two-state solution and so forth, that's much more than, if we look at Likud, who is, when we talk about the river to the sea, Likud's charter still says that is just going to be Israeli sovereignty.
Thank you. And that's actually a perfect place to bring Azzam back in, because watching much of the public discourse on Hamas, there is a lot that's being made consistently by kind of prominent public figures such as Piers Morgan and many others, of the originating Hamas charter as being this anti-Semitic document. And your book details the journey that Hamas has been on since that charter and acknowledges some of the issues with it. So could you tell us a little bit more? I mean, Tristan's kind of referenced it already, but could you tell us a little bit more about that history and what it is that Hamas actually wants today, in light of how this is being framed? Because clearly there is one side that is being accused of wanting to ethnically cleanse all Jews, but there's another side who's actually carrying out an ethnic cleansing in front of us, but is constantly being framed as a reasonable democratic force. So yeah, please.
Well, I think in the early stages, Hamas was influenced by a thinking that prevailed in the region at the time, both amongst nationalists as well as Islamists, that indeed fell into conspiracy theory, into accepting conspiracy theory, or using conspiracy theory to explain the conflict. And they really needn't do that, except for the fact that the Zionists who occupy Palestine call themselves Jews. So if people come and invade you, and they kill you and dispossess you and persecute you, call themselves Muslim, then you are anti-Muslim. If they are Christian, then you are anti-Christian. If they are Jewish, then you are anti-Jewish. So this was the idea. And I think it wasn't clear yet in the minds of the founders of Hamas that this was actually not a Jewish project. It was a Zionist project. And this is what I try to explain in my book, tracing the development of the thinking of Hamas. So the moment the first charter was written, first of all, most of the leadership of the movement had been imprisoned by Israel. Only a couple were left out, and one of them was a teacher of religious studies, a school teacher really, not a university teacher, lecturer. And he single-handedly wrote that charter on the basis of his own understanding of what the conflict is about. And that charter is the worst thing that ever happened to Hamas. It's terrible. It's just terrible. And it's used by the Zionists actually to attack Hamas, to tell the world that Hamas is anti-Semitic. Now, the interesting thing is that you rarely see a Hamas affiliate, let alone a leader, quote the charter. The charter was written at the time. Probably it was celebrated for a little bit, for a few weeks or a few months, and then it was completely forgotten. Forgotten by the Hamas people, but not by their enemies. And that's why when I was writing my book, when I was researching for my book and interviewing the leaders of Hamas, I proposed to them that a new charter needed to be written. And actually in 2005, a meeting was held in Beirut for that purpose. That yes, there is something wrong with that charter, it's used against us. And that was before they won the election in 2006. It became more pressing and more important after they won the election, because when they won the election, okay, they are the democratic leaders of the nation by then, and they needed to use a language to talk to the world that truly expressed the reality rather than a fantasy of some sorts. So in my book, I criticize the charter. I refute conspiracy theory. I expose the fallacy of the document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is used in the charter as in other Islamic and Arab nationalist literature. And actually, we came a long way, except for the fact that the internal politics of the movement prevented the leadership at the time. And I was very close to Khalid Mish'al because we were schoolmates from childhood. He couldn't actually, although he was convinced that he needed to do what I advised him to do, he couldn't do it because there were people who thought that changing the charter at this time could be interpreted as making concessions when everybody in the world was calling on them to prove to be more pragmatic, more willing to make concessions. And people had experience with the PLO charter and what Yasser Arafat did to repeal it, and etc. So that was something. Now, the 2017 document, which was supposed to be a more accurate presentation of the movement, actually failed to do that as well. And I was very critical of it. And I engaged the leadership in so many discussions about it. But they were pressed to come up with something like that because of the pressures of the pressures that was mounting on them as a result of the defeat of the Arab Spring, and increasing demands from their friends and foes alike to come up with a document that could be presented to the White House or to other authorities in the West to prove that Hamas is a pragmatic movement. And actually, if you read the 2017 document, it's a much better document than the first charter, but it's still a lousy document because it has contradictions within it. And I wrote an article detailing my criticism of it. Because on the one hand, it says it accepts a two-state solution, but on the other, it says it can never recognize the legitimacy of the State of Israel. And there are a number of, maybe a couple other main contradictions in it. Yet, I have to stress here that at the intellectual level, the current leadership of the movement, and probably the previous leadership since at least the year 2000, didn't really believe in what was written in the original chapter. And they started in their own rhetoric when they spoke to journalists, when they spoke to academics, when people asked them questions. They were very clear on the distinction between the Jews and the Zionists, between Judaism and Zionism, and I think that is indeed very, very important. And therefore, the question of cleansing the Jews doesn't exist. It's out of the question. See, we Muslims have no problem with the Jews. We lived with the Jews for almost 14 centuries in peace. The oldest Jewish communities in the world were actually in the Muslim lands, in Iraq, in Iran, in Yemen, in Egypt, in Morocco, in Turkey, and in all the other places. Actually, those Jews who are mostly Sephardic Jews, and many of whom ended up being in Israel against their own wish, against their own will, as Avi Shleim testifies in his recent autobiography, 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. And therefore, the problem is not with the Jews. The problem is with a project called Zionism. Zionism as an ideology is the mirror image of apartheid. It is my firm belief that the conflict in Palestine can be resolved if Zionism comes to an end, not the Jews. The Jews can still be there. The Jews can still live with us. They are to us the people of the book. They have a divine covenant that is expected from us in dealing with them. But Zionism, in the sense that it believes in the supremacy of the Jews, and by the way, it's an ideology which most Jews 100 years ago rejected and opposed, and an increasing number of Jews today oppose and criticize. That's the sinister ideology. That's why the Israelis today are doing what they're doing to Gaza. That's why they're doing what they're doing to the people of the West Bank. That's why they did to my mother and to my father in 1948 what they did, and what they did to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, because they believe, they claim that God gave them a license to kill. God gave them a license to dispossess. God gave them a license to do anything in order to take the land of the Palestinians. And they use the Bible to justify this, although the founding fathers of Zionism were mostly secular and atheist, as John Rose argues in his fantastic book, The Myths of Zionism.
And Jazakumullah khair, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that really helps to situate so much of the context that we need for this discussion, particularly about, you know, what is it that Hamas wants? What is it that is actually being proscribed here? What is being banned? What are these legal regimes actually trying to do? And I think we're going to keep on coming back to this idea that context is so key in trying to make sense of all of this. I want to open up to the general public to ask questions. I've already had a few questions coming through to me, but Tristan, I feel so bad of asking you to wake up so early for us. I do want to ask you one more question before we open up to him, which is to follow on from the points that Azzam was making, which is, he's giving us that larger historical context for what Hamas wants and what it's about. But could you just maybe briefly help us to understand the attacks of 7th October in a longer historical context? What is it that Gazans have been facing, and what have groups like Islamic Jihad and Hamas and the Palestinian resistance, what have they been responding to? If you wouldn't mind answering that, and then hopefully we can get some questions from others. Thank you.
Okay, so that's a little bit of a harsh question for 7 in the morning. So I guess what we have to remember is that the attacks on the 7th of October, which we're still waiting for verification of exactly what happened, of course, but seem extremely horrific. There is a lot of context behind that, and we're talking basically like a prison rebellion when it comes down to it. And I guess we have to ask ourselves, if we were in the same situation, what would we have done? So, if all you've known in your life is being locked into basically, what even David Cameron said was an open-air prison, you have no freedom of movement, you have no future, you have no outlets for creativity to go ahead. I mean, what would you do? Would you hate these people? Of course, you would hate these people. Is it justified? I don't know. Well, I'm not going to make that judgment. I come from a very privileged background myself, so we just have to remember that the conflict didn't start on the 7th of October. It started in 1947-48 with the dispossession of 750,000 Palestinians from what is now recognized as Israel for the most part. Destruction of 400, 500 villages. 70% of the Gaza Strip is refugees from that conflict or their descendants. So we need to put that in context and in perspective when we're looking at those things. So when you have a 2-decade-long siege where the Israelis are literally counting the calories of how much can go in and go out. So I forget the particular spokesman, but he said we don't want them to starve, but we'll put them on a diet kind of thing. So you can see where that was something's got to give at some point in time when it comes down to it. And I'm not condoning what happened, but I think it needs to be understood that there is no future for the people of Gaza at the current time, and the only time that the world pays any attention, unfortunately, is when Israelis take casualties, and it is a very unfortunate fact, and quite clearly one of the reasons for the 7th of October attacks was because the Palestinian issue was waning in importance, at least governmentally speaking, throughout the Arab world. So you had the kind of the normalization talks with Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Sudan, the UAE, and so forth. And so on a certain level, this can be seen as a last-ditch attempt to make sure that the Palestinian issue does not go away. And undoubtedly, if that was Hamas's aim, to put the Palestinian issue back on the map, and they've certainly succeeded to derail normalization talks. Again, like I said, from a governmental perspective, I don't think the Saudis or the UAE or Bahrain or whoever cares. But from a popular perspective, obviously, this has galvanized the Arab world and the Muslim world in general, and put the Palestinian question back on the map.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Especially with normalization efforts with the Gulf countries, it seems as if these acts have stemmed the tide of that for now. And even within those countries, there is a lot of reticence about the path that their leaders are taking. It's been interesting to see Jordan in particular take to the streets. We haven't seen these types of scenes since the Arab Spring. We saw Egyptians back at Tahrir, which we haven't seen for a very long time. It's been quite incredible to watch the outpouring of emotion and support from across the world, which kind of neatly brings us to the Q&A, because so many of the questions that were being asked are about this in particular. And Dr. Sophie, for you, there are some questions which I'm going to try and bunch together into one to make it a bit easier for you to manage. If you wouldn't mind, there was a question which perhaps it was my fault, I should have gone into, but first, just explaining what a listing regime actually is. I should have given that context myself, so my apologies to the audience for not doing that. But I think that the larger question that they're asking is, who decides the moral compass within kind of nation states and within the context of the UN? And there's a question about whether or not Hamas is even prescribed as a terrorist organization by the UN. So perhaps if you could take those, please, first, and then we'll get into some of the others. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Asim. So listing regimes basically are lists of designated terrorist organizations. You also have listing regimes that list particular individuals. So that's what is broadly known as proscription regimes. It's a type of counterterrorism tool, if you like. And I guess the thinking behind it, in policy terms, is the idea that by listing a particular organization or individual considered as terrorist, you are then able to freeze their assets, impose travel bans, generally make the membership of a particular group like crime. In certain countries, you can't express any support, for that particular group. In the US as well, you can't even be in contact with anyone from that group, even for research or conflict resolution or whatever purposes. So I hope that explains a little bit more about what listing is, but it's basically in effect how that the tool of proscription operates is through lists. So you actually have lists of designated organizations or individuals, and each listing regime, so country might have slightly different groups on their lists, right? And some countries might have, like with Hamas before, you had certain countries had just the kind of armed, let's say, wing and not the more political wing on the listing. And then for others that changed over time, right? Similarly with Hezbollah, for instance, or, other organizations. Who decides who gets put on these lists or not? Well, it's a deeply political, choice element. When it comes to listings, say, for instance, at the EU level, you need an agreement with the 27 member states of the EU for a listing. Similarly with delisting, that's why it's a very blunt tool or instrument. It's kind of it's not that you're on a list and then things are made clear of how to come off a list or that sort of thing. It's not that kind of policy tool. Broadly speaking, it's often been a case of governments sort of saying, you put my, the groups I consider terrorists on your list, I'll put yours on mine, sort of thing. You have seen quite a lot of horse trading. I don't work specifically on how proscription regimes come about, but there are a lot of, there's a kind of burgeoning, more academic literature on that. But basically, a lot of the listing regimes are also pushed by alliances, by nation states and kind of supportive of these. There are, interestingly, some governments who very actively decided to move away from that. So the Norwegian government, I think, is a very interesting case. In 2006, they actively said that they were no longer going to align themselves with the EU proscription and listing regimes. Though, having said that, the UN one is compulsory, and that was the other question. So Hamas is not listed by the UN as a terrorist organization. And that's pretty central, I think, and key, because the groups that are listed by the UN tend to be Taliban and Al-Qaeda affiliates. And the UN listing regime is also has to be immediately implemented by all the countries in the world, right? So it's not a sort of optional thing. So, for instance, even the case of Norway, that has distanced itself from that political choice, right, of supporting a particular list or whatever, they have to implement, let's say, the listing regime. So, for instance, when some Norwegian diplomats might have been involved in talks during a phase with the Taliban, that was kind of sometimes problematic, especially around no-fly zones and lists and that sort of thing. So I hope that answers the more technical questions a bit. Happy to say more.
Thank you. No, that's brilliant. Dr. Azzam, there's a question about the UN Special Rapporteur to Gaza. I think her name's Francesca Albanese. She said that Israel recently said Israel cannot claim self-defense against a non-state actor, but it's Hamas who is labeled or was prescribed. So the kind of logic doesn't actually make any sense here, because the occupier is the one who's claiming self-defense. So in your scholarly view, why is state violence seen as more acceptable than non-state violence at the international level?
Well, that again is a political thing, really. It's nothing to do with law or with morality. I mean, South Africa, which was an apartheid regime, was recognized and defended by liberal democracies in the West. Nelson Mandela was considered to be a terrorist. And when apartheid fell out or collapsed, and Mandela was elected president, he became a hero. And people started talking in retrospectively about apartheid as something evil. There will come a time when the same thing will happen in the case of Palestine, and Zionism will be spoken about as being one of the darkest chapters in the history of humanity. And by the way, much of this listing is really hypocritical. I can tell you that between 2006 and 2013, at least 4 European countries had back channels with Hamas. They were talking to Hamas through back channels. For a very brief period of time, when Morsi was in power, the Israelis had a back channel with Hamas. So you see, context is very important. The political milieu, the political circumstances. The Israelis and their allies were so frightened when the Muslim Brotherhood became the leaders of Egypt during the democratic transition period, that they wanted to just talk to the Muslim Brotherhood and talk to Hamas and see what would it take for them not to repeal the Camp David agreement that was signed during the time of Sadat. And the British government did actually a lot of business with Hamas, clandestinely, of course, including the rescue of hostages in Gaza at one stage. But then, because the Arab Spring was defeated, and because Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates used their leverage to pressure these European countries, Britain decided to list Hamas as a terrorist organization for purely economic reasons, for reasons that have to do with appeasing their allies in the region, which were the Saudi regime, the UAE regime, and the military coup regime in Egypt. And as a result, the British government was silly enough to lose a very important position, because they could play a role in talking to Hamas indirectly to resolve issues, and when you talk to Hamas is not just a small fringe group in Palestine. Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood represent a major power across the Muslim world, and those who don't see this are blinded by arrogance and by ignorance. So if you have a back channel with the Muslim Brotherhood or with Hamas, you really master a lot of leverage. You can talk to so many important people across the Muslim world and even beyond the Muslim world.
Thank you, and that's so important. These conversations are always difficult, and they're fraught with lots of legal complexity. We do often recognize, I think, that there are those who are permitted to speak about these things in a certain way, in a certain vernacular, because of the way that terrorism laws themselves are constructed. Different types of bodies are racialized in different ways. So it is more of a risk for people of color to speak about the context of Hamas's actions than, say, for example, either Sophie or for Tristan to do so. This is just the reality of the politics of the world that we live in. Tristan, there were already jokes before about kind of white cover in terms of speaking about this. But in the jokes, there is this very, very serious point, right? Which is, how can we have effective conversations? And one of the questions, Tristan, that I wanted to put to you that was being asked is, how do we talk about Hamas and counter sensationalist or Orientalist misrepresentations within such a hostile political environment? How can we disentangle resistance from terrorism? So I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
No, it's definitely been something that I have talked to with Palestinian colleagues and Arab colleagues in the past, back in 2021, when the last, I guess, round of hostilities kicked off. I made a very pointed effort at that stage when I was getting calls from Radio National here, the ABC, and so forth, to direct them to Palestinian colleagues. I said, look, I don't think you should be talking to me about this, and gave them names, phone numbers, all this kind of stuff. And what Radio National did was instead re-air an interview that they'd done with the former Israeli ambassador, the former American ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk, rather than call these Palestinian colleagues up. And so I was very, very upset about them, and they were very much, we appreciate the effort that you went to go to that, but you can say things that we can't. You can say apartheid, you can say ethnic cleansing, you can say genocide, and you won't get cut off as soon as we say that. Oh, we're out of time, So when we talk about the Orientalism and the terrorism designation, it is very difficult for. I mean, look at me. I've got blue eyes and red hair. I can say what I want. There's white privilege involved, and I'm completely aware of that. And in even doing my research, I was completely aware of that as well. Like that, I could get access to people that perhaps wouldn't have been so forthcoming. And you just kind of have to quickly self-acknowledge that. But yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, the prescription of what is the de facto government in Gaza means that it criminalizes all of Gaza, as we're now seeing. Of course, the Israelis have said that anybody who is in Gaza is Hamas, and we will bomb them if you don't move from the north to the south. Then we will bomb you, even if you're in the south, we will bomb you. And we have talked about this previously in publications with along with Yaron Gunning, Tarek Bakoni, Anas Dictate, Martin Keir. We put in submissions to the Australian Parliament when they were talking about proscribing the whole of Hamas, and we pointed this out. This was going to happen. We've recently put in one to the UK Parliament as well. About revising that, and we can clearly see as well is that the political leadership outside of Palestine was completely blindsided, obviously, by this attack, by the interviews that they gave. They weren't very good ones, to be honest. They had no idea this was coming, and we can see that. Yeah, this terrorist designation means that there's no leverage. There's no real, for the UK or Australia, there's no utility to it in any way, shape, or form. There's no evidence that Hamas has any operations that go on in the UK or Australia or the United States or anything like that. We've seen the chilling effect that it has had on pro-Palestinian protests or initiatives, that Hamas has been conflated with Islam and Palestine, and conversely, we've seen how awful it is in terms of anti-Semitism as well, in terms of Israel being conflated with Judaism, and the impact that this will have on, international humanitarian and organizations, anybody who has, in the diaspora, who has links to Gaza, and we can just see how short-sighted these kind of laws are, because who decides who's Hamas and who's not Hamas? I mean, if somebody is working in the civil administration, are they Hamas? If you send some money back from remittances, which is something like 20% of the Palestinian economy, to a member of the family who is working for the government in Gaza, are you then supporting terrorism? So there's all sorts of moral and legal quandaries about what constitutes Hamas, and who are we going to ask? Like, is there going to be, like, does the UK government going to have a committee that's going to decide this? In Australia, it's the same thing, or are we just going to take the Israelis' words for it? And of course, when Palestinians get pulled up in front of an Israeli court, it's almost 100% conviction ratio, according to Human Rights Watch. So what's the point when it comes down to it? And as Sophie said, there are rights under the UN Charter about fighting against occupation, against oppression. We might not agree with the way that this is done, but I think we can see that peaceful means haven't worked in the past in this situation. So people are always like, where's, Azzam mentioned Mandela, and where's the Palestinian Mandela? Well, he's dead, or he's in jail. So the analogies aren't great.
No, thank you. That's really well put. All of this is really interesting for me because these conversations often take me back to the very beginning of the war on terror, and with Guantanamo, which is kind of my area of interest and expertise, because what you had was the US going around the world trying to rally all of this support for its global war on terror, saying we need partners from everywhere, including those who were traditionally seen as enemies, including China. So there was this quid pro quo going on quite regularly, where they would say things like, well, look, there's all these Uyghur detainees in our custody. If you join up to our global war on terror, we will recognize ETIM, the East Turkestan Independence Movement, as a terrorist organization. And of course, all of this becomes particularly bizarre when you fast forward 20 years and the very kind of figures in the US who have been calling for mass expulsions of Muslims, mass detentions of Muslims, have, kind of peddled pretty much every single Islamophobic policy you could imagine, turn around and say, it's terrible what's going on in China with these re-education camps, because the political calculus on China shifted again away from its need to back up the global war on terror. And so all of a sudden, the Uyghur issue became one that the US at a policy level became interested. And I think that speaks to me a lot, that whole kind of 20-year period of them shifting their minds and their policies and their legislation and their designations on these different groups. It really brings the absurdity of the whole thing into such sharp focus. So how, Dr. Sophie, how can we possibly have meaningful conversations when states operate in this way with the type of violent legal instruments that they have at their disposal? Because you could be somebody like Dr. Rizwan Saber, studying your PhD at the University of Nottingham, and download the Al-Qaeda training manual, which is part of your research. And the next thing you know, you've been arrested under terrorism legislation. So yeah, how can we possibly have meaningful conversations in this environment?
I mean, yeah, I think it's incredibly hard. And as you highlighted, I think the thing with these listing regimes and prescription, it has also criminalized a lot of actors around it, even just, researchers, PhD students, journalists, anyone who also wants to understand different movements, organizations, etc. And I think it's really affected as well knowledge and research as well, and kind of understanding. And from the perspective of many governments, and as Dr. Tamimi highlighted, a lot of their contacts or understanding as well have become increasingly indirect, right? Or, shielded, because of the political kind of risks associated with it, or whatever. So I think that's the biggest challenge, is how do you have, engagement conversations. I think also at a policy level, you really need to think through how a tool like this has pushed many groups, has put them more and more. I mean, there's quite a bit of literature on how it's kind of, if you want, and that's not the case with all different organizations because it's very context dependent. But for instance, in the case of the FARC, you could definitely see that it isolated them much more, right? And it kind of pushed them to much more like-minded, if you want, organization. Like there wasn't always a challenge, in terms of the strategies chosen or that sort of thing. And so that's, a really big difficulty, because I think that kind of increased isolation probably also leads to kind of more and more desperate, maybe, or kind of, potentially, really problematic types of strategies or activities. And I was mentioning earlier the case of the Basque Country, and it's a very different case. But I think sometimes it's really interesting to look at lots of different experiences. And for me, what's really telling with that experience is that it was really a kind of a unilateral process within the Basque nationalist movement. It was, in that case, it was other activists, nationalists, civil society, but politicians, like all sorts, who really decided that they wanted to shift the movement strategies, actually. And so that was really interesting to me, because it was about reclaiming an ownership as well, away from a type of violence or a type of strategy, and also trying to create a space away from how they had been framed as well as terrorists, right? So and how to go about that, and kind of trying to reclaim that narrative, and trying to shift also, you know, in actions, and creating alliances that were probably very complicated to do, but very courageous in a way as well. So I mean, you know, no, we really don't think I have any answers to any of this, but that's the big challenge, right? Around creating meaningful conversations and thinking how to go beyond in a very complicated context.
Thank you, Dr. Sophie. Dr. Tristan, I'm merging a couple of questions here together, but you know, we just heard from Sophie about the narrative arc of all of this, and you know, your book, it helps to understand what Hamas has been projecting through a language that is unfamiliar for Western ears, and that is the language of jihad, and that is what your book largely focuses on. So what becomes very oriental, very kind of outside of their frame of thinking, is centered within their own reference points for how they understand resistance. How much of this of a challenge does this present in terms of being able to bridge the divide and the gap between how these groups and these organizations and the resistance wants to project its own moral center against the way that is then received by the rest of the world, and actually not the rest of the world, a very Eurocentric world?
Yeah, so there's a few issues in there, of course. I think over time you'll see that the rhetoric of Hamas has shifted away from the use of jihad because of the negative connotations that it has in the Western world. The idea of a holy war rather than a struggle or an inner struggle, the inner jihad versus the kind of the external one, to be a good person. And you'll see some work with Imad Al-Sus, who has kind of documented how the jargon, the rhetoric has changed from using jihad to resistance, so mukawama. And I think there's a lack of nuance, which I talk about in my book, and it's that resistance can mean many different things. For most Westerners, when we think of resistance, and again, this comes back to that terrorism label, that it's highly unproductive and shuts down any kind of avenue for dialogue. You go back to like critical terrorism studies and things like that, that when we start using that label, it gets carte blanche. State actors, carte blanche in terms of their actions when it comes down to it. And as Sophie said, like, you know, in the US, you can't even talk to someone from Hamas, and I believe it's the same thing with UK laws. It's extraterritorial. So how are we going to understand them? How are we going to come to a resolution with this? But yeah, when we talk about resistance, we have to talk about, you know, social resistance, creating parallel structures in terms of, you know, social networks that either the occupation authorities or the Palestinian Authority are unwilling or unable to provide. We talk about ideological reasons, an idea. This is why this whole kind of concept at the moment with the current Israeli government saying they're going to destroy Hamas. How and what do they mean by that? And I think what we can see at the moment is what they mean by that is ethnic cleansing. And we've seen these Israeli ministers that aren't shy about it at all. So you have senior members of the Israeli government saying that we're going to have a second Nakba. So this is where the problem with the proscription comes from, is that we've heard nothing from the West in general condemning what is happening and what has been happening over the last month or so. And this is partly because Hamas is a terrorist organization. And this is the problem. When you start, how do I put this? When you start dehumanizing or making a distinction between good and evil, as has been done, then you don't talk to evil, right? You destroy it. So this is the problem. The discursive element is a trying to find the word. It's too early in the morning. Excuse for disproportionality when it comes down to it, and so this is the problem when you start prescribing an organization which is the de facto government, that everybody that deals with the Gaza Strip has to deal with Hamas, then you start criminalizing all of that. And it means that there's no leverage. You then have no leverage from outside, and the UK should have leverage, historically speaking. It should have excellent contacts with everybody. That you just then end up reifying the views of hardliners who said, well, there's no point talking, which I think is what we've seen now, that the political leadership outside were completely blindsided by the 7th of October attacks. And something was always going to give at some point in time. I haven't been shy about saying this. It's not a particularly popular position, but I mean, the only time that the world pays attention to the question of Palestine, the Palestine issue, is when Israelis get killed, and it's a very harsh fact that this, Mohammed Diaf was very clear about this, that the violence in the West Bank that's been going on, the ethnic cleansing of Area C, the armed escorts into Al-Aqsa, etc. This is what he's linked in the siege of Gaza. This is what he's linked it to. So it's not happening in a vacuum. And with the Saudi-Israel normalization, that this was clearly a I'm not going to say last-ditch attempt, but it was something that needed to put Palestine back on the map, and it's a really harsh reality when it comes down to it. But the world just wanders off and fixates on something else, unfortunately, until there's violence, and it's really unfortunate that's the case.
Thank you. That's so well put. Yeah, it's interesting because there are all these, we're talking about legal regimes and prescription and, which lists, these organizations belong to, but all of this does is kind of reinforce the idea that there are hierarchies at play here, and the hierarchies operate at kind of manifold levels and down to who is considered a human and who isn't, and the types of language that's permissible to, yeah.
And we can see like the contrast with Ukraine, like, and if we go back a couple of years, it wasn't even subtle. We had foreign ministers and people saying, "Oh, these are literally saying these are blonde-haired, blue-eyed kids," and so you can just see that double standard and that hypocrisy. about who constitutes a human and what kind of worth a human is. So I think that's an important one as well, to like just compare that to the reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to what's happening and has been happening for decades in Palestine.
Well, I mean, I distinctly remember two front pages about former British soldiers who blew themselves up in the process of delivering a strategic objective as part of like Ukrainian resistance, and the way that they were being lionized by the tabloid media for carrying out those actions. And I was like, okay, this is very interesting because the actions look familiar, but the narrative points are completely different. But thank you, Dr. Tristan. I really appreciate the time you gave to us. And Dr. Azzam, as the Palestinian in our group, I wanted to leave the last word with you. And there have been a couple of questions really asking, what's the way forward in relation to, the legal regime is a legal regime. It is a crime in the UK to glorify Hamas and any proscribed group in any way. It makes it very, very difficult to talk about what is currently happening there outside of a Western liberal framing that cages our ability to have honest conversations about what is happening. So in your mind, what is the most effective way that we can have those conversations, but with the specific aim in mind of a way forward, inshallah?
Well, I think we need to probably mobilize public opinion to press on politicians to reconsider their position. It does Hamas less harm than it does those that proscribe Hamas to proscribe it. In other words, if you designate Hamas as a terrorist organization, or for that matter, any other important player in a certain location, if you designate them as terrorists, you probably restrict them a little bit, you probably make life a little bit more difficult for them. But actually, the cost to yourself is much higher, in the sense that you're excluding yourself from playing a role, probably a very crucial role, at certain moments or in certain times. For instance, now the crisis in Gaza, the United States of America and its European allies have to talk to Hamas through the Qataris. Why not talk directly then? I mean, it's silly. It's really rather silly. And they cannot do anything without Hamas. Today, I'm still following what's going on, because of today is the second day of the exchange of hostages and detainees. And when the Israelis tried to run away from their commitments, from the commitments agreed upon, and Hamas said, well, if you're doing this, then we are suspending the process, the Israelis immediately rushed to the Americans. The Americans, Biden called the Qatar, the Qatari Emir, and then the Qataris called Hamas and said, okay, what do you want? And then Hamas eventually had it their way. Such a very long process. Who benefits from this? Only the Israelis. The Israelis, who are behaving in the same way as the apartheid regime in South Africa used to behave, are being pampered, are being appeased, are being spoiled by the leaders of the Western world. And that is costing a lot of effort, a lot of money, and a lot of agony as well. We need really to convince public opinion to make this an important issue. And I think it is today increasingly treated as such by world public opinion, especially in the West. The 7th of October, one of its immediate results is that there's been a revolution in the world about how people view what's going on in Palestine. And I think despite the destruction of Gaza, despite the destruction of much of Gaza, despite the murder of more than 20,000 Palestinians, most of whom are children and women, I think the world is changing because of what's going on in Gaza. And if this is not picked upon or picked on by the leaders of the so-called international community, eventually there will be more radicalization across the world.
Thank you. That's a very sober note for me to, first of all, thank our three experts. 2 hours is a very long time for any event, but I honestly believe that, you know, when you have such expertise in a room or at least online together, that we have to take full advantage and to give them adequate time to help us understand the complexities of these moments that we're in. So Dr. Sophie, Dr. Tristan, Dr. Azzam, thank you so much to the three of you for giving us that time to help understand better the contours of what it is, the challenges that we're facing. I think so many people right now feel very impotent in terms of what they can do. You know, you want to reach out through a screen sometimes and, you know, just try and help, but you can't. It's impossible. And so what we can do, as Dr. Azzam has mentioned, is try and mobilize these moments, try and understand the way that the politics work. And so we have very, very clear targets that we can aim ourselves at, which is, okay, the legal regime itself is wrong. This whole idea of prescription is wrong. Is it possible for us to campaign around that and to try and bring an end to that in order to open up avenues of peace for the future? And I think that's a really important thing for us to think about, to reflect on, and to campaign on in the future. So thank you again, all of you. And yeah, I hope that everybody benefited from this event. You know, we streamed it live on YouTube. I hope you'll subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow the work of Cage. You know, we don't have any support and funding outside of what we get from grassroots support. So, you know, please do continue to support our work in whatever way you can. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
Thank you.